There comes a point when the life you built still looks complete from the outside, but no longer feels entirely like your own. Nothing dramatic may have happened. The home is familiar. The people are familiar. Your responsibilities still wait for you in the morning. Yet beneath the routine, a question begins to follow you: who am I when I am not being useful to someone else? For decades, life may have rewarded you for becoming reliable, patient, productive, agreeable, or strong. Those qualities helped you raise a family, maintain relationships, build a career, and survive difficult seasons. They were not false. They were necessary. But an identity that once protected you can eventually begin to confine you. After 50, the old answers often lose their power. Success may no longer feel satisfying. Approval may feel strangely empty. Obligations that once seemed unquestionable may begin to feel heavier than they used to. You may look at a life that appears respectable and wonder why it no longer feels intimate. This can be frightening because it resembles loss. You may think you are becoming ungrateful, restless, or disconnected. But what if the discomfort is not evidence that you are losing yourself? What if it is the first evidence that a deeper self is no longer willing to remain hidden? Becoming yourself after 50 does not usually begin with a dramatic decision. It begins with recognition. You notice the conversations that leave you depleted. You notice how often you say yes before asking what you want. You notice that the person everyone knows may be only the person you learned to perform. And for the first time, the question changes. It is no longer, does my life look right? It becomes, can I still recognize myself inside it? It is a quiet turning point, the moment when maintaining the familiar begins to cost more than facing the unknown, and honesty starts to feel more necessary than approval. Long before you consciously decided who you wanted to be, you were learning which versions of you were accepted. Perhaps being easygoing kept the peace. Being useful earned affection. Being successful brought recognition. Being strong prevented other people from worrying about you. Little by little, these responses became more than behaviors. They became identities. You may have become the dependable one who never asked for help, the responsible one who always made the sensible choice, or the caregiver who placed everyone else's needs first. You may have become so skilled at anticipating other people that your own preferences began to feel inconvenient. The problem is not that these qualities are unreal. You may truly be generous, calm, hardworking, or loyal. The problem begins when a quality becomes an obligation. Kindness turns into an inability to disappoint anyone. Strength becomes a refusal to admit pain. Responsibility becomes guilt whenever you choose something that benefits only you. Over time, the role becomes a silent contract. Other people come to you for solutions because you always provide them. They expect your agreement because you rarely object. They assume you will remain available because you have repeatedly rearranged your life around their needs. Then one ordinary day, the contract becomes visible. You are sitting at dinner while someone volunteers your time without asking. You hear yourself agree, even as your body tightens. You smile, but something inside you feels absent. The moment passes, yet the discomfort remains because you recognize the pattern. Your life is still being organized around a version of you that everyone trusts, but you no longer fully inhabit. Changing that role can feel dangerous. Not because the role is true, but because belonging may have depended on it. And this is where becoming yourself begins to feel less like freedom and more like risk. Why does this conflict often become louder after 50? Because time begins to feel different. When you are younger, life can appear almost unlimited. There is another decade, another opportunity, another chance to reconsider. Even permanent choices can feel temporary because the future seems large enough to absorb them. After 50, the future may still contain many meaningful years, but those years begin to feel more valuable. You become less willing to spend them maintaining expectations that no longer make sense. The cost of postponing yourself becomes easier to see. At the same time, the structures that once organized your identity begin to shift. Children grow older and need you differently. Careers slow down, change, or lose their emotional importance. Relationships reveal patterns that were easier to ignore when life was busy. The body begins asking for attention instead of obedience. Even your tolerance changes. Conversations you once endured become exhausting. Obligations you accepted automatically begin to feel intrusive. You may want more silence, more honesty, and fewer performances. Others may describe this as becoming difficult with age. But often, it is not bitterness. It is clarity. You are beginning to understand the price of constantly abandoning yourself to maintain an image. The realization may arrive while looking at a crowded calendar and noticing that almost nothing in it reflects what you genuinely want. Or while hearing someone praise your life and feeling unexpectedly distant from the person they are describing. That moment can carry grief. You may wonder how much time was spent becoming who you were expected to be. But grief is not proof that your life was wasted. It is proof that you can finally see the difference between adaptation and choice. The deeper question is whether you will keep living by decisions made by an earlier version of you who was still afraid of losing acceptance. When the old roles begin to weaken, you may expect immediate freedom. Instead, you may first experience emptiness. Without the responsibilities, routines, and expectations that once defined you, there may be no quick answer to the question of who you are now. This is why many people mistake identity change for failure. They believe they should already know what they want. They assume uncertainty means something has gone wrong. So they rush to fill the space. They create new goals, accept new obligations, or search for another identity to perform. But the absence of an answer is not always a problem that needs to be solved. Sometimes it is a space that needs to be protected. For decades, your choices may have been shaped by urgency. Bills needed to be paid. Children needed care. Careers demanded commitment. Relationships required compromise. There was rarely enough silence to hear yourself. When that silence finally arrives, it can feel uncomfortable because your mind has learned to measure identity through usefulness. If no one urgently needs you, you may wonder whether you still matter. If you are not helping, solving, producing, or carrying someone else's burden, you may feel strangely invisible. But usefulness and worth are not the same thing. You were never meant to exist only as a function in other people's lives. And here is the deeper reversal: perhaps you are not mainly afraid of changing. Perhaps you are afraid that the people who love the useful, agreeable, dependable version of you will not know how to love the person who now has limits. That is why saying no can feel like betrayal. That is why rest can feel selfish. That is why an honest preference can produce guilt. The fear is not simply, who will I become? It is, will I still belong if I stop being who everyone needs? This is the hidden conflict beneath many midlife changes, discovering which relationships can survive your truth. The return to yourself rarely begins with a grand reinvention. It begins with small acts of honesty. You pause before saying yes. You notice what your body does around certain people. You allow a preference to exist without defending it. You choose one quiet afternoon without turning it into something productive. You stop explaining a boundary to someone who will not accept it. These small actions change your relationship with your inner life. Each one says, I am allowed to exist without performing a role. At first, this honesty may create discomfort. Some people may call you distant because you are no longer endlessly available. Others may say you have changed because they can no longer predict your compliance. Their reaction does not prove you are selfish. Sometimes the old arrangement depended on your self-abandonment. The goal is not to reject responsibility or erase the life you built. It is to choose again, with greater awareness. You can remain loving without disappearing. You can be dependable without becoming permanently accessible. You can care for others without treating your needs as moral failure. Becoming yourself after 50 is not about inventing a new personality. It is about recovering the parts of you that were repeatedly postponed: curiosity, play, anger, tenderness, ambition, rest, creativity, solitude, and desire. You begin from experience, not nothing. Perhaps this is why the process arrives later for so many people. Earlier life teaches you how to belong. Later life asks whether belonging has required too much of your truth. So return to the question that began this journey: can you recognize yourself inside the life you are living? You do not need a perfect answer today. Begin with one honest choice. One boundary. One preference. One moment in which you do not abandon yourself. Because becoming yourself is not a final destination. It is the decision to stop leaving yourself behind. 39219